He was just standing outside his own home, minding his business. But his neighbor didn't see a homeowner. She saw a threat. One phone call later, the police arrived. Just when things seemed to take a turn for the worst, the officer took one look at him, and everything changed. What happened next left the neighbor speechless. Stay tuned to find out. The sun rises over a quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets are lined with well-kept houses, trimmed lawns, and parked cars. It looks peaceful, like the kind of place where people know their neighbors and feel safe. But sometimes, appearances can be deceiving. A black SUV pulls into the driveway of a newly sold house. The driver steps out and looks around. His name is Michael Carter. He's in his mid-30s, tall, well-dressed, and confident. He moved here for a fresh start, excited to settle into his new home. Michael takes a deep breath, feeling the crisp morning air. He has worked hard to get here. He is a successful entrepreneur, runs his own business, and gives back to the community. Moving into this neighborhood is a milestone for him, but not everyone sees it that way. Across the street, behind white lace curtains, Mrs. Henderson watches him. She's in her late 60s, with sharp eyes and a permanent frown. She has lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. She knows everyone, or at least she thinks she does. She narrows her eyes as she sees Michael step out of his car. Something about him makes her uncomfortable. She doesn't know why, but she doesn't trust him. Maybe it's because he doesn't look like the usual neighbors. Maybe it's because she doesn't recognize him. Michael unloads a few boxes from his trunk. He carries them inside, minding his own business. Mrs. Henderson keeps watching. She takes a sip of her tea, shaking her head. Days go by, and Michael starts settling in. He jogs in the mornings, waves at passing neighbors, and waters his plants. But every time he steps outside, he feels a pair of eyes on him. He doesn't have to look to know who it is. Mrs. Henderson isn't the only one who notices him. Other neighbors glance at him too. Some are polite, offering a smile or a wave. But others look unsure, hesitant. Michael knows what's happening. He has seen it before. He's not surprised, but it still stings. One evening, as the sun sets, Michael stands outside his house, talking on the phone. He doesn't notice that across the street, Mrs. Henderson is on the phone too. And this time, she's calling the police. Mrs. Henderson grips her phone tightly. Her voice is sharp and urgent as she speaks to the 911 operator. "There's a suspicious man outside my neighbor's house," she says. "I don't think he belongs here." The operator asks for details. "He's standing outside, talking on the phone. He's been lurking around for days. I don't know what he's up to, but I don't feel safe." Her voice shakes slightly, but it's not fear. It's certainty. She truly believes something isn't right. The operator pauses. "Ma'am, has he done anything threatening?" Mrs. Henderson scoffs. "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time." She watches Michael from her window. He's standing near his car, laughing at something on the phone. He's relaxed, unaware of the accusations being made against him. "Please send an officer quickly," she insists. The operator sighs and relays the call to dispatch. Meanwhile, Michael finishes his call. He stretches his arms and looks around the neighborhood. It's peaceful, just like he imagined when he moved here. He doesn't notice the shadow behind the curtain across the street. Inside her house, Mrs. Henderson sits by the window, waiting. She feels a sense of accomplishment. She did her part. She protected her neighborhood. Minutes pass. Then, the sound of an approaching siren fills the air. Michael turns his head. A police car slowly pulls onto the street. The flashing lights reflect off the houses. He frowns, confused. He hasn't done anything wrong. The car stops in front of his house. The door opens, and a uniformed officer steps out. Mrs. Henderson leans forward in her chair, eyes locked on the scene. Michael watches as the officer approaches. He stays calm. This isn't the first time he's been in this situation. He already knows how this works. The officer stops a few feet away. His expression is neutral, unreadable. "Sir, can I see some identification?" Michael exhales. His hands move slowly, deliberately. No sudden movements. He pulls out his wallet and hands over his ID. The officer takes it and glances at the name. He nods but doesn't speak yet. He looks back at Michael, studying his face. There's something familiar about him. Michael folds his arms, waiting. From across the street, Mrs. Henderson watches with satisfaction. In her mind, justice is being served. But she doesn't realize that things are about to take a very unexpected turn. Michael stands still, his heart steady. He has done nothing wrong, but he knows how these situations can go. The officer, Sergeant Jenkins, examines the ID in his hands. His expression stays neutral. He glances up at Michael, taking in his calm posture and steady gaze. "We got a call about a suspicious person in the area," Jenkins says. His voice is firm, but not aggressive. Michael exhales slowly. He knew this would happen eventually. "Suspicious?" he repeats. "I live here." Jenkins studies him for a moment. "Can you confirm your address?" Michael gestures toward the house behind him. "That's my name on the mailbox. I closed on this house 2 weeks ago." Jenkins looks back at the house, then down at the ID. Everything matches. There's nothing suspicious here. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson is still watching, her eyes filled with satisfaction. Michael sighs and speaks again, his tone measured. "Can I ask who called this in?" Jenkins glances toward the house across the street. It's obvious. Michael follows his gaze and smirks. "Figures," he mutters. Jenkins shifts on his feet. He's been on the force for years. He's seen real criminals. He knows what a threat looks like. Michael? He's not a threat. Still, he has a job to do. "Sir, I appreciate your cooperation," Jenkins says. "Just give me a moment to run a quick check and we'll be done here." Michael nods, crossing his arms. Jenkins steps back, radioing in for a routine background check. The dispatcher responds within seconds. "No priors, no warrants, registered homeowner at the given address." Everything is clean, just as Jenkins expected. Michael doesn't flinch. He's used to this routine. Jenkins sighs, rubbing his forehead. He's about to hand Michael his ID back when something clicks. The name, the face. It's familiar. He studies Michael again. "Wait a second. Have we met before?" Michael raises an eyebrow. He wasn't expecting that. Jenkins squints, trying to place the memory. Then it hits him. His eyes widen slightly. He knows exactly who Michael is. And now, everything about this situation feels different. Sergeant Jenkins stares at Michael for a moment, his mind racing. He knows this man. But from where? Then, it all comes back to him. Months ago, there was a charity event in the city, a fundraiser for underprivileged youth. Jenkins had attended with a few fellow officers. The keynote speaker that night had been a successful businessman who had grown up in a rough neighborhood but worked his way up through hard work and determination. That speaker was standing right in front of him. "Michael Carter," Jenkins says slowly, piecing it together. "You spoke at the community outreach event last fall about helping kids stay off the streets." Michael's eyes narrow slightly. He wasn't expecting that. "Yeah," he says. "That was me." Jenkins lets out a short breath, shaking his head. The realization stings. He was called here because a man, an accomplished, respected man, was simply standing outside his own house. Jenkins glances across the street at Mrs. Henderson's house. Her curtain is slightly open. She's still watching, waiting for something to happen. He turns back to Michael, feeling a wave of frustration, not at him, but at the situation. "I remember your speech," Jenkins says. "It was inspiring. You talked about second chances, hard work, giving back." Michael nods. He's not sure where this is going. Jenkins takes a step closer, lowering his voice. "I want to be honest with you. This call, it was unnecessary. I ran your ID. You're exactly who you say you are." Michael smirks slightly. "I could have told you that." Jenkins sighs. He feels the weight of what just happened. He was called to question a man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Michael watches him carefully. He's dealt with officers who wouldn't have hesitated to escalate things. He knows how differently this could have gone. "Listen," Jenkins continues. "I need to address the caller. Would you like to be there when I do?" Michael tilts his head, thinking. He doesn't need to. He could just let it go, walk inside, and move on. But something in him says no. "Yeah," he says. "I'd like to hear what she has to say." Jenkins nods. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson is about to get a knock on her door she never expected. Sergeant Jenkins walks across the street, his boots hitting the pavement with steady steps. Michael follows closely behind. His face is calm, but his mind is racing. Mrs. Henderson sees them coming. Her eyes widen. She wasn't expecting this. A moment later, there's a firm knock on her door. She hesitates. Her heart beats a little faster. This wasn't how she thought things would go. Slowly, she opens the door. "Ma'am," Jenkins says, his voice steady. "You called in a report about a suspicious person." Mrs. Henderson straightens her back. "Yes, officer, I did. I was just looking out for the neighborhood." Jenkins nods. "I understand. But the man you called about is Michael Carter. He lives here." Mrs. Henderson blinks. She glances at Michael, then back at the officer. "Are you sure?" she asks, her voice quieter now. Michael exhales sharply. "I've lived here for 2 weeks," he says. "I work here. I pay taxes here. Just like you." Mrs. Henderson looks away. She shifts uncomfortably, but she isn't ready to admit she was wrong. Jenkins crosses his arms. "Ma'am, I ran his ID. He's a respected member of this community. He's done more for this city than most." Mrs. Henderson swallows. I didn't know," she mutters. Michael chuckles dryly. "You didn't ask." She looks up at him, finally meeting his eyes. "I was just trying to be cautious," she says defensively. "You can't be too careful these days." Michael nods slowly. "That's interesting, because my neighbors on both sides met me when I moved in. They introduced themselves, asked questions. But you? You skipped all that. You saw me and decided I didn't belong." Mrs. Henderson's face turns red. She has no response. Jenkins watches her, then sighs. "Ma'am," he says, "I suggest you think twice before making calls like this. You could have put an innocent man in danger today." Mrs. Henderson nods stiffly. She knows he's right. Michael takes a deep breath. He has nothing else to say. He's already said enough. He turns and walks away. Jenkins lingers for a moment before tipping his hat. "Have a good evening, ma'am." And with that, he follows Michael back across the street. Michael steps onto his front porch, his hands in his pockets. He exhales slowly, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. The sky is painted in deep shades of orange and blue. Sergeant Jenkins stands beside him for a moment, quiet. "I'm sorry this happened," Jenkins finally says. Michael glances at him, then back at the street. "It's not the first time," he says. "Probably won't be the last." Jenkins nods, understanding. "People like her," Michael continues. "They don't see people like me as neighbors. They see us as intruders, no matter what we do." Jenkins sighs. He knows Michael is right. He's seen it before. "Well," Jenkins says, "I hope she learned something today." Michael lets out a small, humorless chuckle. "Maybe," he says. "Or maybe tomorrow she'll just find another reason to be afraid of people who don't look like her." Jenkins doesn't argue. He knows there's truth in Michael's words. Michael turns to him. "You didn't have to handle it that way," he says. "I appreciate it." Jenkins nods. "I became a cop to protect people," he says. "All people, not just the ones who look like me." Michael studies him for a moment, then nods. "Good," he says. "We need more like you." Jenkins pats his badge, a small gesture of respect, then steps off the porch. Take care, Mr. Carter, he says. You too, officer. Michael watches as Jenkins gets back into his patrol car and drives away. The street falls silent again. He stands there for a long moment, letting the events of the day settle in his mind. Then, finally, he turns, unlocks his door, and steps inside his home. A home he belongs in. A home no one can take away from him. Thank you for watching this story. It's a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, and we should always take the time to understand people before judging them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us keep creating content that matters. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so let us know what you think about this story. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Let's start a conversation. And if you think this message is important, share this video with your friends and family. You never know who might need to hear it today. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.